Under the bruised sky of early evening, a wagon rolled into Coyote Bend. Its wheels groaned through the dust like old bones remembering the trail, and the smell of rainless wind hung in the air. On the seat sat a man and a woman, he upright, silent as a gravestone, she small beside him, clutching the edge of her shawl as if it might keep her from vanishing altogether. The town watched. Windows tilted open, curtains twitched. Out here, gossip could gallop faster than any horse, and by the time the wagon reached the hitching post outside the chapel, everyone already knew, Jedediah Rourke had married Clara May Hollister for a cow. The preacher's voice had been brief, his eyes heavy with discomfort. The ring Jed slid onto her finger was dull brass, a relic from his first wife, and his hand trembled only slightly as he did it. Clara remembered the murmur of flies, the click of spurs from a man shifting his weight in the back pew, the way no one met her eyes. When the vows ended, Jed tipped his hat to the preacher and muttered, "Much obliged," as though sealing a business deal. He didn't look at her when they stepped outside into the sun. Coyote Bend was a place stitched together by dust and debt. Its people measured worth in acreage, stock, and survival, not tenderness. Jed Rourke fit right in. He was known as a hard man, fair but flinty, the kind who believed silence could fix anything broken. He'd lost his wife 2 winters past, found her one morning pale and still beside the hearth, fever having claimed what drought could not. Since then, the house on the ridge had grown quiet as a tomb. The ranch survived, barely, but Jed himself had withered into a man-shaped habit. Clara May was 23 and looked younger in the light, though her eyes held the dull sheen of someone older. Her father's debts had chewed through every bit of pride the family had left. When Jed came calling, not for love but for recompense, the bargain was struck without her consent. "He'll feed you," her father said, unable to meet her gaze. "And you'll be of help to him." A milk cow changed hands that same afternoon, and by sundown, Clara had become Mrs. Rourke. The wagon ride to the ranch was long and mostly wordless. The plains unfurled in endless gold and rust, windmill blades turning slow against a fading sky. Jed's hat brim cut his eyes into shadow. Clara watched the land roll by, acres of brittle grass, a creek reduced to a whisper, a lone hawk circling above as if waiting for something to die. The air smelled of iron and dust, the scent of everything parched. When they reached the homestead, the sun was down. The house stood on a rise, its roof sagging slightly, the porch steps warped from years of neglect. Inside, the air was cool and dim, the walls lined with shelves of tools and jars of nails. The scent of tobacco and old wood filled her lungs. Jed showed her the kitchen, the pantry, the water pump out back. "You'll find your room upstairs," he said. "Mine's across the hall." His voice was low and even, carrying no malice but no warmth either. Then he turned and left her there, standing in the hollow quiet of her new life. That night, Clara unpacked what little she owned, a Bible, a comb, a faded blue ribbon, and placed them neatly on the nightstand. She could hear Jed moving below, the scrape of a chair, the sound of boots being pulled off. She wanted to speak, to thank him for the roof, for the bed, but something in the air warned her not to. So instead, she whispered a prayer to no one in particular and lay awake listening to the coyotes sing. Days passed. Clara rose before dawn to milk the cows, mend the fences, sweep the porch. Jed gave her work without conversation, pointing or nodding rather than speaking. He ate alone, slept early, and seemed to avoid her as though proximity might burn. The townsfolk came by sometimes, bringing tools or gossip. Their glances slid over Clara like rain off wax. At the general store, she caught whispers, "Poor girl, traded for livestock. He's just doing what he must." She kept her eyes down and her hands busy, wrapping twine, weighing sugar, pretending not to hear. But each word stuck to her like burrs. In the evenings, when Jed sat on the porch with his pipe, she would bring him coffee. He never thanked her, only nodded. Sometimes she stood beside him, hands clasped before her, watching the stars ignite one by one. She wanted to ask him about his wife, about whether the silence between them would ever thaw, but the questions dried up in her throat. He seemed carved from stone, a man protecting himself from memory. Once, she caught him staring at the old rocking chair near the window, the one that still bore a faint dent from where his first wife used to sit. His expression was not grief but something heavier, like guilt. When he noticed Clara watching, he looked away, muttering, "That chair's got no business being moved." She nodded, understanding it was not the chair he feared losing again. The drought worsened. The fields cracked open, the creek turned to dust. Jed spent long hours out with the herd, his shirt stained with sweat, his skin like leather. Clara mended his coat one afternoon, sewing carefully where the seams had split. When she left it folded on the chair outside his room, he said nothing. But the next morning, she found a jar of wild honey on the kitchen table, no note, just the offering. It wasn't sweetness so much as acknowledgement, and that was enough to make her chest tighten. By the second month, rumors reached town that Jed might have to sell his cattle. Clara overheard it from Mrs. Tate at the store, the woman's voice dripping pity. "A shame, really," she said, "him marrying that girl and still losing the herd. Some folks just cursed." Clara smiled politely, bought her flour, and walked the long road home through heat that shimmered like glass. That night, she found Jed sitting on the porch, a bottle beside him, staring out at the dying fields. His shoulders sagged under the weight of everything unsaid. She stood behind him, the hem of her dress brushing the floorboards. "You can't keep feeding ghosts, Jed," she said softly. Her voice surprised even her. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he turned his head slightly, eyes catching the lantern glow. It was the first time he'd looked at her, really looked. There was something raw there, not anger, not tenderness, but recognition. The kind that comes when two lonely souls realize they're made of the same quiet hurt. He said nothing. The wind stirred the dry grass, carrying the faint scent of rain that might never come. Clara waited, her heart thudding in her chest, the silence stretching long enough to become a kind of promise. Then Jed looked away, exhaling smoke toward the horizon. "Storm coming," he murmured. But Clara, standing behind him, thought she felt the first drop already, soft, almost invisible, landing on her cheek. The storm came without warning, rolling over the plains like a dark tide swallowing the sun. Wind clawed at the shutters, and the air split with the scent of iron and rain. Clara stood at the window, lantern light trembling across her face as thunder cracked over the hills. Beyond the porch, the sky bled violet and black. Jed was already saddling his horse. "The herd's restless," he said, cinching the strap tight. "If they scatter, we lose what's left." "Jed, you can't," she began, her voice almost lost in the rising wind. But he was already mounting, his shape swallowed by the storm's blur. She caught only the gleam of lightning on his slicker before he vanished into the darkness. Hours passed. The storm raged with a fury that felt personal, hammering the earth, tearing branches from the cottonwoods. Water seeped under the door, pooling around Clara's boots. She moved through the house lighting every lantern she could find, the flames shivering in protest. Each flash of lightning carved the room in stark relief, the empty chair, the untouched supper, the brass ring glinting faintly on her finger. When the barn door slammed open in the wind, she froze. For a moment she thought it might be Jed returning. But the cry that followed was not human, it was the shrill panic of animals. She snatched a lantern and ran out into the rain. The world outside was all noise and movement. The wind ripped at her shawl, stung her cheeks, drove the breath from her lungs. The lantern flame struggled but held, a trembling halo against the blackness. Mud sucked at her boots as she reached the barn. The roof had half caved in, rain poured through the jagged hole, washing over a fallen beam. Beneath it, a horse kicked weakly, pinned. And beside it, Jed. "Jed," she cried, rushing forward. He stirred, eyes glazed, blood running from a cut along his temple. "Clara, get back," he rasped, voice barely a thread. "Roofs. But she was already moving. The beam was heavy, waterlogged, splintered at the edges. She braced herself, hands slipping, muscles screaming as she heaved. For a moment it didn't budge. Then something inside her, a quiet, stubborn flame that had survived every humiliation, every whisper, burned hotter. She lifted again, grit in her teeth, rain blinding her eyes, until the beam rolled free with a sickening thud. Jed gasped as air returned to his lungs. She hauled him up by the shoulders, dragging him out into the open, the mud slick beneath them. Lightning flashed again, illuminating his face, pale and stunned. "You should have left me," he murmured. "I don't leave things to die," she said simply. They staggered toward the house, the storm breaking around them in sheets. Each step was a battle, wind pushing them sideways, earth turning to quicksand. By the time they reached the porch, Jed was half conscious, his weight sagging against her. She managed to get him inside, lowering him before the fire she coaxed back to life with shaking hands. His breathing was shallow but steady. Clara cleaned his wound, tearing strips from her own petticoat. The storm howled against the walls, but inside, the only sound was the hiss of the fire and the fragile rhythm of his breath. She touched his cheek once to be sure he was still warm. Then she sat beside him, soaked to the bone, watching his chest rise and fall. At dawn, silence fell, a silence so pure it seemed the whole world had stopped to listen. The fields shimmered under a thin veil of mist. Clara stepped onto the porch, her body aching, her hands raw. The air smelled of wet earth and ash, a scent that promised both ruin and renewal. Behind her, she heard movement. Jed was awake, leaning weakly against the doorway. His face was gray, eyes hollowed by exhaustion, but he was alive. He looked at her as though unsure she were real. "You pulled me out," he said. "You'd have done the same," she replied, though she wasn't sure he would have. He tried to smile, failed, then looked past her toward the sodden fields. "Lost half the herd," he said quietly. "Half's still living," she answered. "We can work with that." The words hung between them, light as breath but heavy with possibility. For the first time, she saw his guard falter, not broken, just dented enough for light to seep through. Over the next days, they moved like two halves of the same motion. She mended the barn, he limped beside her, offering what strength he could. Their conversations remained few, but gestures began to take shape where words once failed. A cup of water left by his bedside. His hand steadying hers when she climbed the ladder. The smallest things, shared silence, shared purpose, wove a new kind of language between them. Coyote Bend noticed. The whispers turned cautious, then curious. Mrs. Tate, who once pitied her, came by with bread and found Jed on the porch sanding a plank while Clara painted the fence. They looked, for once, like a pair rather than a rumor. By sundown, the story in town had changed. Folks began saying maybe the Rourkes were making it after all. One evening, as the last light sank beneath the horizon, Jed brought something from the shed, a porch swing made from salvaged barn wood. The same board she'd fought against that night. "Reckon it'll hold," he said, setting it in place. She traced the grain of the wood with her fingers, feeling the scars there, like her own. They sat together, side by side, the air warm and still. No words passed between them. He reached over and placed something in her hand, the brass ring, newly polished. "Suppose I didn't give this proper the first time," he said, eyes fixed on the horizon. She turned it in her palm, light catching on its worn edges. "You don't owe me anything," she whispered. He shook his head. "Not owing. Just, seeing." The wind carried the faint smell of rain again, distant but promising. Clara looked out at the plains, now washed clean, the fence lined with wildflowers she had planted weeks ago. The world felt fragile, reborn. Later, as dusk melted into night, she hummed softly, the same tune she'd sung when she thought he might die. The notes floated into the dark, brushing against the cricket's song. Jed leaned back, eyes closed, a faint smile tracing his lips. For the first time, the silence between them felt whole, like a place they could live inside. And when the wind shifted, bringing the soft rustle of grass, Clara thought she heard the land itself exhale, grateful, perhaps, that two broken souls had finally remembered how to stay.